Welcome to the Debrief podcast presented by FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by my co-host Jackie Augustine. This week, it's all about elections.
Yes.
The general election is just 2 weeks away, and we're going to be breaking down the biggest races shaking out throughout the Finger Lakes, every county, every race. We may not be going into great detail about every county and every single race.
Got
but
papers and computers.
We've got all the technology, all the stuff. We're a week and what are we, like a week and like a half-ish, a week and like 6 days, 5 days away?
Yeah.
How do you feel? How do you feel under 2 weeks?
Well, you know, some of these races are higher stakes than others, I think. So there are some I'm really following, and then there are others when you handed me the list, or when you emailed me the list earlier in the week, I was like, oh, yeah, I guess I didn't realize there were so many town coroners that are for election. I don't really have much to say about that.
Right. And that's the big, and also I'll say this. If you go through, and right after this podcast is over, we'll be publishing the full list of every single race happening in the Finger Lakes on our website, and a lot of uncontested races. And I feel like this is something that we always wind up talking about, always winds up being a part of the discussion. In fact, I think last year or the year before, possibly, I had you on my podcast Inside the FLX after your race previously for mayor, and it was we a big part of that discussion was, God, it's like not a lot of people actually turn out and want to participate in local government.
It's sad, really, because I think people are starting to see, at least I hope people are starting to see on the national level and on the state level, that, you know, the way people move up in the ranks has a lot to do with the tone that's set locally. So, you know, I always try to remind people that a lot of their congressmen were former mayors, and you know, local government matters because it does serve in some respects as a pipeline to higher office. And unfortunately, it also, the tone that we see at the national level is sometimes reflected at the local level. So if we can correct it and have higher expectations and better discourse locally, then maybe that will trickle up and things will get better nationally, maybe. I hope. That's my hope. That's why I stay engaged in local stuff, right? The idea is that this is where it matters most, and it'll affect. Well,
and not only that, but even on the local stage, what we end up seeing is sometimes there is actual confusion. And the first topic we're going to be talking about today is actually bred in that confusion. Proposition confusion. There are two propositions on the statewide ballot that have people, I don't want to say completely mystified, but
that's probably pretty accurate.
There's some line blending that I think is a little misdirected. So proposition number one calls for a constitutional convention.
Right.
Proposition number two allows judges to revoke or reduce the pension of public officers convicted of a felony related to his or her duties.
Yes.
Am I summing that up correctly?
Yep.
So what we have here is the reaction to it. We ran a story a couple weeks ago now about number two, the second proposition there, where those who have been found corrupt would lose their pensions.
Right.
We're finding that a lot of the readers were actually confused and thought that this was somehow connected to the narrative that pensions are going to be eliminated or reduced or significantly cut if there is a constitutional convention.
Yes.
No, not the same
thing.
Right,
the two are two separate
completely different things.
And it's very interesting because the actual proposition on the ballot for the Constitutional Convention, which is like the big ticket, complicated, multi-tiered process, you know, this vote is just the first vote. Then you would actually next year have to select who are the delegates. Then after that, you would have to review their amendments and determine whether or not you actually want to revise the Constitution, the state constitution. That just reads, shall there be a convention to revise the Constitution and amend the same? Yes or no? Well, I think the actual wording is very bad because it couples having the convention and actually amending the Constitution as the same thing. And initially, I was supportive of the idea of a constitutional convention because I think there are a lot of things that are antiquated about our Constitution, that are overly wordy, that don't reflect the reality of what our current values are. So I liked the idea. But when you think more about it and what's at stake and how this unbridled campaign finance nonsense that we keep talking about but still can't get changed could actually affect that system, now I actually think it's a fairly scary proposition to have a constitutional convention under the parameters that are given right now. But then the fact that the actual proposition says and amend doesn't make clear that there is a separate vote to amend the Constitution. So I think it gives people the idea that this is the whole kit and caboodle right up front, which it's not, but it's just poorly worded. So I don't know who thought, let's take this really complicated issue and make it one kind of ambiguous sentence, whereas all the other propositions are like a paragraph.
Right.
So that, that leaves me a little leery about that. I have more to say about the Constitutional Convention issue if that's what we're going to talk about. But on the face of it, just at first, I think the ballot proposition doesn't help the cause at all.
To me, and this is just my own, from reading some of the stories, from listening to what some people have said, it seems really presumptive to me that people are already, and I guess this, given the ambiguity that you're talking about in the wording itself, is, I mean, you can understand that people's expectations go there, but it really seems to be painted like this doomsday scenario for, oh no, this vote happens and almost as if immediately pensions are going to be cut.
Right.
And it's a really long and hefty process, and it's really hard to actually have the process even happen in the first place. It's not something like New York is not going to drastically change overnight just because this proposition is either passed or does not pass.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what people have to keep in mind. And just on the corruption side, connected to number 2, this is something that has been, I'll say, spouted off by a lot of people for a long time. Politicians are corrupt. We need to clean politics up. We need to not allow these people to get away with crimes and
right,
and
build their career on
to now activity. Just without doing an extensive amount of research. And this is on the voter, in my opinion, because the voter needs to do what they have to do to be informed when they're going out to vote. Don't just go by the sign that you see alongside the road. Don't just go by the mailer that comes to your house addressed to you. Do your own research about these issues. Actually look into these issues. And truthfully, number 2 is one that we've really needed for a long time. And to have a concrete, this is how this will be handled moving forward, would be a really good, wholesome step for New York State to finally get hammered out.
Well, and I would just remind people that during the last state Senate races, this was a huge issue. The need to be able to strip the pensions of, at the time, Sheldon Silver and how am I forgetting his name?
We've been unconvicted. It doesn't even matter.
Dean Skelos. Sorry.
They've been unconvicted.
But yeah, but remember, that was a lot of the discussion, and people were saying, yes, I mean, if you, if you're convicted of corruption, you should forfeit your pension. And then other people were pointing out, right, but currently that's not allowed under the state system. That has to be amended. So absolutely, proposition number 2 makes sense, is needed. I mean, it's a small step. It's not going to prevent corruption completely, but at least maybe it would make some of these people think twice before they do engage in this kind of activity, that if they're thinking that they're just going to be able to resign their seat or retire and disappear into obscurity and collect their pension after having done this to the taxpayers of the state, at least maybe that would cause them to think twice a little bit. But I think, yeah, absolutely, proposition number 2 should should be supported, and I hope it passes because it's needed. It's definitely needed.
And it is definitely not a silver bullet by any means.
Right.
There are a million things that need to be done. This is just a very nice first step.
Yeah.
And moving forward, I think one of the topics that we'll end up going into down the road on this podcast is actually the discussion around New York State and teachers and the strength of some of the unions and how this whole sort of how we've gotten to this point where people are very defensive of their pensions, what few pensions actually exist today. But that's not why we're here. We're here today to talk about all of the races that are happening. So what we're going to do is we're going to go county by county, and we're going to have a little breakdown of these contested races. We're going to give you an overview of the races that are taking place. And we'll start with Cayuga County. 5 contested legislative races. We've got an Auburn City Council race, and then supervisor races in Genoa and Moravia. Obviously, Cayuga County is a very large county. It's one of those geographically like Seneca County in that you have wildly different political and social approaches. Very rural, very urban, that mix. Always interesting to me to kind of see how these, and in a lot of ways it's like an Ontario County where you have a Geneva or a Canandaigua as opposed to a Bristol or a community like that. That said, Conquest Town Council, Fleming Town Council, Ira Town Council, the Ledyard Town Clerk, Ledyard Town Justice, Ledyard Town Council, Mentz Town Council, Montezuma Town Council, Montezuma Highway, Moravia Town Council, Owasco Town Council, Scipio Town Council, Summerhill Highway, and the Victory Town Council all have races in addition to those that we mentioned in the first part, just not nearly as interesting. Like we said, highway races, there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, highway supervisor and coroner do puzzle me a little bit. I'm not sure how you make a distinct political position out of, a partisan position out of those functions. Those seem fairly straightforward. I'm not sure that Democrats pave roads differently than Republicans. I'm not sure that that they do forensic analysis of death differently from a partisan perspective. I hope not. So yeah, that's always kind of surprised me. I think those are just holdovers to the idea that government jobs are supposed to be kind of plum political appointments. And that I could have less of, clearly. So it's interesting, though, that in Cayuga County, like you were saying, like Seneca County, in some of these communities, you do have what you would consider to be traditional contested races, Democrats and Republicans, conservative and working families. But in some of the more rural areas, it's really a contested race between a Republican and a conservative, or a Republican, a third-party line who is a Republican that is breaking off from the Republicans. So we see that in all the counties, that in the more rural areas, it ends up being more like a Republican primary than a general election kind of race.
And I'll also say on the structural government side, I'm always very curious about these counties that have a legislature, and yet you still have town
councils,
supervisors, and councils. And I'm just I always kind of wonder what that relationship looks like. Is it more efficient? Does it work better than having the supervisors actually be the county representatives as well? Is it less efficient? Does it just add another layer of bureaucracy? Genuinely curious.
Yeah, my opinion is that it's another layer, but that if your population is small enough and you don't have independent water, sewer, police, fire services, I'm not sure what's being managed that is much different than the county. Now, I'm sure, and I welcome feedback from the supervisors and counselors from these very small communities about their value-added service to their community. And I certainly like the idea that people should be represented, by someone that represents fewer rather than a huge district.
Right.
But decision-making wise, maybe that's just an argument for making your county legislature bigger and more representative than actually having all these independent layers of government. that's a bigger discussion than just elections, though.
Oh, and also we will be underneath this video. There will be links to timestamps where we talk about each individual county. So if you want to, if you're listening, and you're like, I don't want to hear about Cayuga County. I live in Schuyler County. We're going to talk about Schuyler County right now, but you'll be able to navigate via the description down below. So Schuyler County, 3 legislative district races that are contested: 1, 2, and 4. And then we've got the Dix Town Clerk race, the Hector Town Council race, Orange Town Clerk, Orange Highway Superintendent, and the Tyrone Town Council. The only interesting thing that I want to point out here, obviously all of those races are interesting if you live in Schuyler County, especially with the countywide races, given that the fight against Crestwood seems to be the county issue that everyone is talking about, and it actually has a pretty big impact on the folks who live in Seneca County and Ontario County. Just look at who's been turning out regarding those. But interestingly enough, a report just surfaced the other day from the Watkins Review, I believe it was. In the town of Tyrone, they found some DOT documents that had actually been forged.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is kind of, and that was just the supervisor had just announced it at their last meeting about a week and a half ago, and that is the backdrop of this Tyrone Town Council race, where you have 4 individuals, 2 Republicans, a Democrat, and a individual party, we'll call it, someone who created their own party, running for 2 available seats.
Right, and when I was looking at this, I just wanted to, let me pull it up really quickly. There was one highway superintendent race in the town of Orange, which I have to admit I do not know where that is, who is running on the listening party. And again, I am curious, and I should look up and do some more research to find out what the listening party is about when it comes to highway superintendentship, like what that looks like. But I was going to say that the issue you were just talking about in the town of Tyrone has a Justice for Tyrone group, and also a leadership third party running for council. So that's interesting to me that it has spawned these third parties that apparently are running on that particular issue or something like it.
Mm-hmm. And also, I will note, in that second legislative district, Joseph Campbell, who is a big voice in the anti-Crestwood Save Seneca Lake movement, is running on the Democratic line for that seat, for one of those seats. I believe there's a couple, either 2 or 3, that will be accepted out of that district. Memory fails me at this point, but we'll have all of the details.
I think it's just one from the district.
One from that district?
Yes, but there are 4 people, or I'm sorry, there are 3 people on 4 lines. Okay. So, yeah, and I think that's a great example because he's running both on Democratic Party, but also people first. I think this kind of grassroots effort that he is someone who's been really active in environmental issues, now saying, well, hey, the way you're really going to get some stuff done is to get into elected office and be part of that. So I think we're seeing a lot of that around the counties, which I think is a good thing. That's the reason people should run, because they are active and they see government as a solution and not necessarily always just a problem. And
also, I will point out, a lot of the highway races that I've seen through our intense documentation here, a lot of them are like pave our roads first, or like really super creative titles that I think are pretty much just made to kind of make the point of why they're running. Yeah, there are some creative names. Yeah. At any rate, we'll move on. Next up, of course, let's talk about Wayne County. A lot of contested races in Wayne County, surprisingly. The district attorney race, of course, the headliner, Michael Calarco taking on David Fulvio. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think so. Democrat and Republican facing off. And then, of course, the Walworth Town Supervisor and the Red Creek Village Mayor race. Red Creek Village. I recall this, maybe it wasn't this last year, but the year prior to that, they had a village board race that had no one running for it. And I remember thinking to myself, this is where that argument, where people will come in and say, okay, there needs to be, if you can't fill the office, how effectively can you run the government?
Right.
And that's where I kind of think this whole like dissolution discussion, that's really where that should be taking place.
Yeah. And that's what you're seeing, because for village trustee, vote for any two, nobody is on the ballot. Yeah. So it says you must write in your candidates. Yeah. So, yeah, if anybody knows someone in Red Creek, you better start going through the phone book and coming up with some candidates that you want to represent you. But that's, it's...
And the numbers will be really interesting. So we'll be back here on election night, going through the results, and what we're going to wind up finding is I'll make a prediction that less than 20 people will turn out to vote in Red Creek. Far as...
I hope you're wrong.
I hope I'm wrong,
mean, that's...
too. It's sad.
It is sad. It's... And I have more to say about that. But, by contrast, then you see in like town of Walworth, for their town council, you've got all kinds of, you've got the Sunshine Party, We the People, all kind of vying for these positions. And that looks like there's a lot of activity going on up in Walworth. Yeah. So, I mean, I see, Susie Jacobs. I mean, there are people that are running who are well known and have been involved in local issues for a long time. If I would be remiss if we didn't cover in Wayne County that Keenan Baldridge is running unopposed for his seat for Rose Supervisor, and he ran for the Senate race that was vacated by Senator DeZolio, and has been on your show. And I was actually sad, to see him not become our state senator, because his command of the issues and the amount of homework he does, Rose should be feeling so blessed that they've got a supervisor who takes it that seriously. If everybody put in that same amount of effort, local government would be in much better shape. So I'm not surprised he's running unopposed, because I think everybody, even though it's a Republican town...
I was going to say, I believe he's one of the only Republicans, if not the only Republican on the Wayne County Board of Supervisors.
Democrat.
Democrat.
Right, yes, on a Republican board, because I think people are so impressed with what he brings to the table. And I think that's another argument for, you can't judge a book by their political affiliation, because people who do good work, regardless of the party affiliation, need people's support. Mm-hmm. You should be willing to come out and vote for somebody who's doing a good job, even if you've told yourself you would never vote for a particular party. I mean, I just don't find that to be a wise way of making a decision.
Yep. And some of the other races shaking out in Wayne County, the Galen Town Council has candidates running: Huron Town Justice, Lyons Town Justice, Lyons Town Council, Macedon Town Council, Marion Town Clerk, Ontario Town Council, the Rose Town Clerk, Savannah Highway, Sodus Town Justice, Sodus Point Village Mayor, in a contested race that I actually forgot to highlight.
Oh, okay.
Really, really, really interesting to me, because this race shaped up out of the flooding that was happening at Sodus Point.
Oh, okay.
During the spring, when the rain was up and Lake Ontario there was this, what seemed like from the outside, a little bit of a power struggle in terms of some really upset residents saying, wait a second, our village leadership isn't doing enough.
Right.
We need to do
Where's
more.
the advocacy? Right.
Yeah. And while I do think that as much as could have been done was done under those circumstances, short of draining at Lake Ontario, there wasn't much else that could have been done. I do find it interesting that a Republican opponent was picked up to challenge Christian. That said, we've also got the Walworth Town Clerk race, Walworth Town Council, as you just mentioned, in the Wolcott Town Council for a vacancy. Interesting stuff. It'll be really interesting to see how some of these, especially I think that's one of the big things. I always like to look at the rural races to see what the turnout looks like, because unlike some of our more urban areas, Geneva's, Canandaigua, Auburn, the turnout just isn't usually in line, especially in a non presidential year. Obviously.
Yeah. I am curious to see what turnout will be, because I think that in this political climate, it could go one of two ways. People might be frustrated with how contentious things are at the national level and might be checked out. Or, and what I'm hoping, is that people see how contentious things are at the national level and they say, oh my goodness, like, we need to get in there and make sure that our local business is taken care of, because I know it's a cliche, but local government is where the rubber meets the road, right? So you can be as upset and engaged in federal issues as you want. But if you're checked out of local stuff, you're really missing the biggest ticket items that are affecting people's lives immediately. I mean, local government decisions, even though they might seem slow, because government in general is slow, are the quickest turnaround in terms of impact on people's lives. Because, as we've seen in Seneca Falls, you know, a vote taken today could have immediate consequence tomorrow, you know, next week. And on the national level, usually there's more lead up, more debate, more discussion, more procedural stuff before things take effect. And I just feel like if you're not paying attention to local government, you're really missing the action. So
next up will be two counties to the south of Seneca and Ontario. We've got the Tompkins County and Yates County races. In Tompkins County, we've got 4 legislative races, a bunch of races which are a mix of contested and not contested in Ithaca. And then in Yates County, a district attorney race, 2 legislative district races for District 1 and District 3, as well as a Barrington Town Supervisor race. The only other races taking place in Yates County that are contested are for Torrey and Benton Town Council. All the others, and there are others, I think one of the things that a lot of people would be surprised about, especially in like Schuyler County, Tompkins County, Yates County, where there aren't a lot of contested races that we're highlighting, there are still a lot of positions up for election.
Right.
Just a lot of people running unopposed.
Yes, and you can see that too when you look at Tompkins County and you look at their legislative races. I mean, you have 2 of the seats that are, again, we were talking about how in Cayuga County some of them are Republicans versus Republicans. We see in Tompkins County they're Democrats versus working families, or you know, so it's essentially like a Democratic primary. So it makes sense that the towns and villages that go along with those legislative districts would probably have unopposed races if one party has just, you know, tips the balance so heavily in terms of enrollment that they're satisfied with whoever they've elected and they've not put up a challenger. In general, I like when parties either put up a challenger or cross-endorse someone if they think they're doing a good job, because elections are the opportunity to tell people either, yeah, carry on, you're on the right track, or wait a second, we've got to change things. But I don't understand not taking a position. I mean, we're going to see that in Ontario County in a second, but it's kind of strange. But then by contrast, in Yates County, their district attorney race has been this ongoing battle between these 2 candidates, Gardner and Casella. And again, that's heavily within Republican-leaning parties, independents, conservative, reform. And
everything from residency to petition signature everything has been thrown out in this race. And it's actually probably, if I were picking 1 or 2 that I think are just downright interesting because of all of the, you know, stuff that's been going on, I think that's, to me, the one, maybe the most interesting, because it's just been, this was the first race that we saw stories about in the news. In like June, July. And
I would say the Wayne County DA race also. And also maybe the Seneca County DA. These are hotly contested races, and the tactics that are used, like you were saying, to raise issues don't necessarily focus on the substance of what the person's experience is or what they'd bring to the position, but it does tend to circle around these other questions about petition filings and about mailers. And I've just found that kind of interesting for a DA's race.
Well, speaking of DA's race, so let's talk about Seneca County now. We'll jump into Seneca County. Here are the contested races as they sit currently. Obviously, the heated race for district attorney, county treasurer, county coroner, 2 available seats, but I believe 3 are running. Covert town supervisor, covert town council, Fayette Highway Junius town supervisor, Lodi town council, Ovid town council, Romulus town council, 2 Seneca Falls county supervisor seats. These are those at-large seats that don't serve as a town supervisor but just serve on the county board. Seneca Falls Town Council, Town of Tyre Supervisor, Tyre Town Council, Tyre Highway Superintendent, Varick Town Council, Waterloo Supervisor, also 2 seats at large. And then also the Waterloo Town Supervisor seat is up as Gary Westfall walks away from politics. And then Waterloo Town Council, 2 seats that are actually up, and then another to fill a vacancy. Got 2 people running for that vacancy, and then the Waterloo tax collector.
Right.
A lot of races happening there. To me, personally, seems like the most interesting ones. Obviously, the district attorney's race for reasons that we will likely discuss here. The Seneca Falls and Waterloo supervisor races for the at-large seats. Both really interesting. The Junius Town Supervisor race, that's been one that I found really interesting.
Well, they had a shakeup in the primary.
Right.
So that was
Greg Wadhams, who was the sitting supervisor, lost his primary.
Right.
His Republican primary, lost to one of his board members. And now we'll have Ernie Brownell take on Ron Servin. Ron Servin, a former supervisor in Junius. So a return possibly of a former face in politics, which isn't unusual in local government. It isn't unusual to see people walk away for a few years and then step back into it. Of course, the Seneca Falls supervisor race for those 2 at-large seats, Rachel Weil, Tim Hopkins, Paul Cronenwetter, Ralph Lott. Really interesting race because it's a mix of incumbency, name recognition, really diverse backgrounds, some new ideas, political newcomers. It's a really, really like across the board spread. And I have the feeling personally that the Republicans have the advantage at this point only because of what Seneca County's voter makeup looks like.
Okay.
That said, expect the unexpected. You never can tell. And no one from any of these Seneca Falls races, whether it be Seneca Falls, the supervisor race, the town council race, no one has been campaigning, I'll say, really hard in that they've been throwing shots at anyone or anything like that. Right. In the last several weeks, it's been very quiet. It's been very contained. And, aside from an appearance, but the candidates came on my podcast last week and then the beginning of this week to talk about their races. Aside from that, it's been a really quiet campaign so far. And it'll be very interesting to see how it turns out because, of course, it will ultimately be connected to the landfill because Seneca Falls cannot unchain itself from this polarizing issue that just keeps the town, the community completely divided.
Right.
So it will be interesting to see how this sort of plays out and,
Yeah, and I think, of all the candidates that are running for that Seneca Falls supervisor race, Rachel Wheel's the only candidate I've been able to hear from directly in person. But I think with you having invited them onto the show, it's interesting to see different perspectives in their approach to what the relationship should be between the Seneca County Board of Supervisors and the Seneca Falls Town Board in terms of whose territory is whose in terms of the landfill. So, this odor control, monitoring, this online complaint system, which we've talked about before, which seemed like common sense. Of course, you want an independent vehicle to receive complaints instead of the potential offender policing themselves. I mean, just the idea of that, if you think about it like from a criminal justice perspective, we wouldn't allow that. We wouldn't say, hey, you're on probation. It's up to you to tell us if you have violated or not, and we'll just take your word for it. So that issue, I think, might be something that is still in people's minds as they're heading to the polls. And I hope that it is, because I do think that Seneca County as a county has a vested interest in economic and environmental, social justice stake in making sure that the Seneca Falls Town Board is not the only or last say in the operations of the landfill. So it will be interesting to me to see how that shakes out, because I think that will tell a lot about how people are viewing the issue and what kind of oversight they're looking for, they're comfortable with.
So then, of course, shifting gears, let's jump into Ontario County.
Okay.
Obviously, a little bit of a landfill debate has been taking center stage up there as well. I've seen some stories over the last few days where residents are gathering, and I'm always a little bit cautious after seeing how this landfill issue has played out and how it's affected politics here in Seneca Falls and in Seneca County for that matter. I am always a little leery about inviting that kind of like divisiveness into politics unnecessarily. So in Ontario County, and the reason why I say this is pretty simple, because Ontario County is in a completely different situation with their landfill as opposed to Seneca Falls, Seneca County, and that relationship with Seneca Meadows. Totally different.
Yep.
When the county decides that they want to cease landfilling, when they decide that they are no longer going to be invested in this type of business, then they will cease doing so. I mean, it will be a simple closure, simple transaction. It's much more complicated here in Seneca County because of the ownership status. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons. That's my main reason. That said, so we've got the district attorney race shaping out with Jim Ritz and Christina Carl. Canandaigua City Supervisor for Wards 2 and 2 and 3. Canandaigua City Council races. Geneva City Supervisor, we've got 1, 2, 3 of those happening. Bristol Highway Superintendent is up. Canandaigua Town Supervisor, which I think has kind of quietly become the most interesting race.
Well, Sam Casella running again on the No Bull Party, which that was one of my... Ontario County has my 3 most interesting name awards. That's one of them.
It's fascinating. Then we've got East Bloomfield Town Council, East Bloomfield Highway Superintendent, Farmington Town Council, Geneva Town Justice, Geneva Highway Superintendent, Gorham Highway Superintendent, Naples Town Council, Phelps Highway, and Seneca Highway Superintendent seats also all up. What races stand out to you in Ontario County that you're really interested in?
Well, I mean, the one that I'm most concerned with is the city supervisor races, because Geneva has this interesting situation where Ontario County uses weighted voting on their Board of Supervisors. And in theory, if the city of Geneva's supervisors could actually agree on what is in Geneva's best interest and vote Geneva's interest as a block on some of these controversial issues, Geneva could actually get some better representation. This is what concerns me. There was a candidates' night that the League of Women Voters put on for these supervisor candidates, and I mean no disrespect to the League for this, because it's an important public service, and I'm glad that they do it. Their format is to take questions from the audience, and for the most part, I I mean, I think they do screen the questions to make sure there's nothing inappropriate, but the questions are not necessarily sophisticated, not necessarily issues-based. They're kind of these softballs. What are Geneva's strengths? What do you bring to the table? What's your favorite color? No, they didn't ask what's your favorite color. But, I mean, in theory, it could have been something like that. Do you support the troops, right? I mean, this, and I'm thinking to myself, I am not seeing a lot of nuanced discussion about legislating. And there were some statements that were made that are actually like logistically false, like people saying, here's what I will do, when actually like legally that's not allowed, like that's not how county government works. And there was no mechanism to correct the record. I mean, unless you expected another candidate to do it, in which case then they might be violating the no, mentioning or disputing another candidate's words kind of provision. So it was very polite and nice and uplifting, I guess. Everybody got to talk about their strengths and what they love, and they love their families, and everybody loves everybody. But I left there thinking, man, if people aren't paying attention to what the county issues are and how county government really works, they could walk away from this not really having a good sense of who they should vote for and who they should avoid. So that was of concern to me. I don't know if there have been a lot of other candidates' nights that have around the
I'll just jump in right here because you're talking about something that kind of really piques my interest.
Okay.
As a news guy, as someone who has moderated debates, actual debates, not candidates' nights, I feel like that's a really like coy way to get candidates to show up to something. It gives them the insurance that, one, they will be there, but two, they probably won't have to answer anything too hard-hitting.
Right.
Because that's exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. We have tried to organize multiple this year.
I know.
Multiple debates. None whatsoever have actually come together, not for any reason on our side, but literally because the candidates do not want to participate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you see here is and I totally agree that what the league is doing is a service and it's important, and thank God someone can get all these people in this place together, but just call it something more tame. Call it like meet and greet. Call it a meet and greet.
Yeah.
Don't call it a forum. Don't call it a debate. Don't call it anything like that. Because if you're not going to ask objectively down the middle hard questions
with follow-up,
that, you know what? At this point, I'd just even take real questions. Because what you were just describing is exactly what I think most candidates actually want to see. They don't want to be asked hard questions.
No,
that's the opposite. Especially,
I mean, look at in that
you're
this
running
is
a campaign.
Yeah.
Do you want to be hit with hard questions? No, of course not. You would much rather be hit with softballs, so you can just knock them out of the park. Do you support our troops? Of course, I support the troops.
If you don't want hard questions, you shouldn't be running. I mean, that has been my point. And Geneva has this tradition in local races. The past couple of races now, including my own, one party, not my party, has declined any debates for exactly that reason. That, well, what if things get out of hand? What if it's hostile? Jackie might say something, whatever. But the idea is, if you don't know the issues and you're not comfortable coming in and saying, here is my platform and here's why these are good solutions, and no, I don't agree with this, then what are you running for? Because that's what actual governance takes, the ability to articulate what your position is, why you think it's the right thing to do, and how you will respond or interact to people who disagree, and how you're open to revising your own opinion based on good new evidence. And one question at the candidates' night said, things are so contentious at the national level, and I think underlying that was that there's been some candidate stuff going out that, some candidates supported Trump and whatever. How is that going to influence their ability to get along with people? And there was all this discussion about, I listen to everybody, everything's going well. But while the candidates are speaking, some of the candidates that were talking about how respectful they would be were had side conversations and making like little sneers and jabs at the people at the other end of the table speaking. And I thought, is anybody going to comment about the hypocrisy of saying one thing and behaving another way? No.
And here's the other side of that. So they take questions from the audience, or they take questions from readers, or I like that to a certain extent, but why put that pressure? Why put that amount of weight on voters when it seems to be pretty well established that a vast majority of the adult legal voting age public does not inform themselves about election, does not actually get involved in even voting in the first place? We see these horrid turnout numbers every single year, and it sounds really cynical of me to say this, but why would we hand that baton off to voters when they've already proven that they aren't readily engaged? Now, that said, good questions can get them engaged.
Right.
That's how you do it.
Yes. Show people what's at stake. Show people what the decisions are going to be, and let them see governing philosophy, command of the issues, ability to integrate data into their responses. But I'm not as cynical as you are. I don't necessarily think leaving it up to the audience means you won't get the hard-hitting questions. I think what ends up happening at these events is, if you look at the audience, who's there? Only people who are already supporting one candidate or another. So the questions are softballs because they're plants. And that bothers me because...
that's cynical.
Yeah,
that's way more cynical than what I said.
No, that's that's a commentary on reality, unfortunately. Okay. If they were only taking questions from undecided voters, that would be more interesting. But here's the thing that bothers me, and what I think a missing piece. If we could reform local government, I think it would start with this. The League of Women Voters does an excellent job studying issues. They have got this comprehensive voter's guide about all the proposition. What's at stake? Put it in layman's terms. What will this do? Who's opposed to it? Why? Who's for it and why? Nonpartisan. Excellent. There has to be something like that for local government, because when you have a candidates forum, somebody impartial needs to be able to say, okay, these are the top 3 issues that were discussed last year that are going to come up again. How do you reason through this? And then when somebody says, whoa, I've always felt that way, someone has to be willing to say, but actually the voting record shows you didn't vote with the Geneva supervisors on landfill issues on this and this and this. Why is that? Instead, people can say whatever they want. I mean, people could have promised to buy everybody there a puppy and nobody would have said anything. And I left frustrated because this is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And how do you get information out? Yeah. And one of the questions, was, well, how are you going to keep in contact with your constituents? How will you let people know what's going on? And almost everybody, not everybody, almost everybody gave the same answer. You've got my phone number. You've got my email address. You've got my Facebook page. One person said they don't use Facebook, but whatever. Like, you can contact me whenever. I'm available to you 24/7. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, who's going to come and talk to you if they don't know what's going on? Yep. The way you keep in contact with people is your job is to get the information and push it out there in a way people can actually understand and react to. So in that race, in the supervisor's race, I understand the accusation that I'm partisan because the people that I'm supporting are the Democratic candidates. But for me, it is not about party. It is about, for the incumbents, it's about the actual work and effort and voting record and ability to stick, to make a promise and follow through, or if you can't, to explain why. Mm-hmm. And about just awareness of what's at stake And I just didn't see that in the other candidates.
And I'll also say this. I just went on a rant about debates and this, that, and then forums. Prove me wrong. If you want to say, if you're listening and you're a voter
Yes.
and you want to see your candidates actually debate issues against one another,
Right.
let them know, talk to them.
Stop voting
Reach
for
out,
people who won't debate.
Stop voting for them, whatever you have to do.
Right.
And remember, we will literally host a debate between any candidates who are willing parties to take part. So,
There's still time. We could do that.
A week and a half, and it can be moderated by yours truly. It could be moderated by whoever. Whatever.
This is when people are actually paying attention. The
Exactly.
last 2 weeks of the election is when people actually start to say, oh, wait, there's an election. I better find out who's running. This is the best time to have a debate.
Last year, when we hosted the debate for the 54th Senate District, we had all three candidates in studio together talking about the issues. It was a polarizing race.
And it was a well-run debate. And everybody, I think, who participated appeared as though they left feeling that they had been heard.
Every single one of them were happy.
Yeah.
Every single candidate was happy leaving that night because they had a chance to actually show the people who would possibly be voting for them, or even undecided voters, how they differ from the people they're running against.
Yes.
That's what people want to know.
Yep.
At any rate. So we will be coming back before we get into our hits and misses for the night here. We will be hosting our election night special like we do every year, beginning at 8 o'clock on election night. We'll be running some interviews with candidates that led up to the election, and then we'll be talking to winners, maybe even some losers. We'll talk to anybody.
Calling people.
We'll be going through results live, real time. It will be probably last about 3 hours. It's usually how long it takes for all of the races to finally be final or unofficially final. So we will have that on election night. And now let's jump into hits and misses. Would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first?
If you have yours, you should
I'll
go first. Okay.
Okay, so you probably heard about this. I'm going to start with my miss.
Okay.
Governor Cuomo vetoed legislation sponsored by State Senator John DeFrancisco, which would have established a short-term commuter permit for Syracuse area thruway drivers between exits 34 and 39. With the permit, motorists wouldn't have to pay tolls for using the highway. That's my miss because I remember, obviously not in my lifetime, but I've been listening to people much older than me tell me, when the thruway was built, the tolls were just supposed to pay for the construction. They were just supposed to pay for itself. Now, it's a revenue stream. And in Governor Cuomo's veto message, he literally said he didn't want to interrupt the revenue stream, which is astounding. Like, that admission, even years after, even after everyone's resigned to the fact that it's going to cost money to ride the thruway no matter what, like, just to kind of like rub salt in that wound that is probably one of the most historic and long-standing wounds that this state has ever had, because that was the promise. The initial promise was that it would just pay for itself, and then it wouldn't. Then it wouldn't cost riders anything else.
Right.
And I find it it's just the bluntness of it, I think, that really doesn't sit well with me. I don't like the bluntness of just...
I agree with you, but you know what I don't like? I didn't like and this is, I don't mean to encroach on your myth, but I would back up and say I don't like the fact that they made a promise like that in the first place, because who thinks a road doesn't need maintenance? I mean, we just talked about all these bridges and all this infrastructure stuff. So it seems to me like, hey, let us do this, and you're never going to have to pay for it again, because once it's done, it's done. I mean, someone should have called that bluff way back then and said...
Okay, so I'll even add the flip side to that. I'll say, okay, if that's the case, if that's the approach, then in theory, any road, any bridge, local or can be tolled, can have a toll added to it.
Well, that's what your taxes are supposed to cover.
Exactly. Exactly. And in all this discussion about taxes and needing to spend more money on infrastructure, needing to do this, needing to do that, this was just kind of like, oh no, that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
No, just get out of here with that. Okay, then this should be the most pristine roadway in New York State if you have this added revenue stream that's different than every other road.
Yeah.
And it's not. The thruway is nice, but it's not that nice. I know I ride a long stretch of it every day.
Yeah.
It's just not that nice. So, you know, they make efforts. It's a part of it. To me, I think it's on the same schedule that every other state and local roadway is on. You know, you have as this, and this road starts to fail or need repair, it gets repaired, and then so on and so forth, and you just kind of cycle through. It's an endless cycle. But that's my hit or my miss.
Okay.
My
All right.
frustration. And my hit actually is just going back to what we discussed before. All of the candidates that I have had on my podcast, Inside the FLX, this cycle, both district attorney candidates here in Seneca County, Geneva City supervisor candidate, and then both Seneca Falls County Supervisor and Seneca Falls Town Council candidates all have come on the podcast, and I might be forgetting one or two others, but it's reassuring to see them willing to come out and actually discuss these things and talk about the things that are happening. I think it's really important. I think it's important for voters to actually know where candidates stand.
Okay. Okay, my miss, and this probably will not come as a surprise, but I don't know if you saw the article yesterday that came out with the former head of the Independent Ethics Commission, Jane Feldman.
Yes.
Who said on record, I would tell them that this appointment was a waste of money and didn't do anything. And I say, now she's back in Colorado at an independent ethics institute, and I say kudos to her. Now you're going to say, well, I thought this was your miss, and it is my miss, because the miss is on the state Senate and Assembly and the governor who put somebody into a position for a lot of money, like $173,000 a year, and gave them zero authority and said, we know there's a problem, go in there and pretend to fix it. And they knew going in they would not back anything that she did. She said that the entire appointment turned out to be more about public relations than reform. She was limited in what she could do, so she quit. So I'm going to use this for both my hit and my miss, because I think Jane Feldman, even though she's not a native New Yorker, has showed incredible service and spirit to the people of New York State by being unwilling to stay in a position that does nothing. And let me tell you, we talk about local elections and stuff, that in state government, in any bureaucracy, there's always a position that serves a public relations function only and isn't actually doing the work it's supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. And for her to blow it out of the water and say you care about ethics, but you really don't, I hope is a wake-up call. So I appreciate, my hit is her honesty. I'm glad that she did that. I'm glad she went so public with it. And my miss is the state government that continues to ignore and enable a problem that they all benefit from and that we state taxpayers all suffer from.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe on our next post-election show, that'll be one of the topics that we actually get into and discuss, because I thought the timing of that was really interesting. But that is going to do it for this week's podcast. We will be back in November for our post-election wrap-up show. And don't forget, we'll also be presenting our annual Election Night Live 2018 exclusively here on FingerLakes1.com. That'll be results and everything else going on. Hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, all of those great places. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Debrief podcast.